Okay, so it's currently 4:30 in the morning for me, which means that if I stop making sense, someone needs to kick me to the corner and move on. But just to wake myself up, I'm going to I'll begin by just asking, is there anyone in this room who's heard of Knowledge Unlatched? Yes? And how many people in this room are involved in monograph publishing and humanities publishing rather than journals and science publishing? Anyone? We have 1, 2, great, okay. Well, so, okay, I'm starting this talk with my Knowledge Unlatched research hat on, and I'm the Director of Knowledge Unlatched Research. I've been involved with Knowledge Unlatched since we sort of came up with the model and piloted the Knowledge Unlatched model, I think in around 2011, 2012. But I had hacked a postdoc in order to convince my university that they should let me go away and experiment in the land of scholarly publishing, which is how I got involved with Knowledge Unlatched. And once my postdoc finished, I moved back into a university where I'm now directing the Knowledge Unlatched research program. And that means that in order to add a little bit of context to the work that we're doing at Knowledge Unlatched, it's probably helpful for you to know that I'm also the director of a research centre at Curtin University, which is in Australia, hence my jet lag. And the work that we're doing to explore data around open access scholarly books is building on collaborations that we have developed and are continuing to develop with a whole bunch of players in the library, platform and publishing space. So they include the University of Michigan Library, which we have a research collaboration with, Queensland University of Technology on the east coast of Australia. The Operas project is a European Commission-funded infrastructure project, essentially working to upgrade infrastructure that supports open access publishing, predominantly in a European context, but I think that it's going to have implications for well beyond Europe because it's dealing with infrastructure for digital books and open access books, and of course there's my centre. So as I'm sure that most of the people here are aware, the approaches which have been developed in relation to understanding usage and impact for science and for journal articles don't map easily onto books. But as someone who's a little bit in love with the humanities and social sciences and with monographs in general, I happen to think that that's because books are especially interesting. This isn't a deficiency in monograph publishing. This is actually, something which is really wonderful about monographs and which is resulting in some really important opportunities to think about how we engage with what we know about how open access content is used and how we think about impact and value for libraries and for publishers and for researchers as we make a shift into open access spaces. So some of the key differences between monographs and the humanities and science and journal publishing are that monograph publishing is an area that is populated by a lot of small players, and there are very few large players operating in this space which have captured a large part of the market. So it's a really, really diverse space, which means that there are lots of small players that we've got to engage with through projects like Knowledge Unlatched, and then also when we're thinking about developing approaches to understanding usage of open access content. It's also interesting because monograph publishing isn't famous for being profitable, particularly not in the humanities and social sciences. It's an area that has been slow in many ways to shift into digital formats and to sort of engage with some of the possibilities of new technology, in part because there are a lot of mission-focused publishers who aren't necessarily hugely resourced or making very large profits in this space. And that has changed the way that infrastructure has been built and invested in, and it's really shaped the landscape in a particular way. There are also different ways of thinking about value for research communities in the humanities in particular. So I was just having a conversation with Eric right before this panel kicked off, and my take on this has been that the humanities, many scholars in the humanities think of impact metrics and things like journal impact factors and citation-based metrics, approaches to understanding value and impact in the humanities as part of an active attack on the value of the humanities and on the value of long-form publishing and publications, and also on the deep reading and kind of deep engagement which humanities scholars in particular tend to value. So my understanding of a lack of some of these harder metrics around monographs has been that actually there hasn't been huge demand for those kinds of metrics among humanities and social sciences communities that are publishing these kinds of books. When we're choosing a publisher, we're thinking about, you know, much sort of more niche approaches to understanding the credibility and the quality of a particular publisher. We're thinking about smaller audiences. Most monographs, I think, on average, have been selling around 200 copies of hardback monographs. So these are sort of a form of publication that has been circulating in relatively low volumes, but we're thinking about audiences that are part of a research community that we're operating within. So there are different ways of thinking about value for authors, and there are also different ways about thinking about how we might want to be measured and valued in these discipline areas. And finally, the really important thing that I think everyone should take notice of in relation to the humanities and to monographs is that, in part perhaps because monographs have been in trouble for a few years, and in part because a lot of monograph publishers haven't been especially well funded, so there's been, you know, a lack of services and worry about whether or not monograph publishing can meet the needs of the communities that depend on this form of publication. There's been a huge amount of experimentation going on in libraries and by researchers who care about books, and also by publishers. So there's a lot of this kind of distributed innovation and experimentation, and a lot of it's happening at relatively small scale, but potentially I think it's very, very powerful, particularly once it starts to be coordinated and networked a little bit better. But the flip side of all of that diversity, which I think is great, is that when it comes to understanding how monographs in general are being used and how open access monographs in particular are being accessed and used, standardisation would make life a lot easier. And monographs haven't been particularly standard in a lot of the formats that they've been shifting to when they've made the moves into digital, and that's especially pronounced when we look at how open access monographs are being shared and made available. So there are publishers that are experimenting with revenue and sustainability models and how that could fit with open access, and what people mean when they say open access isn't standard. There are some presses which are making HTML view on screen versions available for free and calling that open access, but relying on a sort of freemium model and selling other kinds of versions. There are other groups of publishers who are engaging with programs like Knowledge Unlatched and making CC BY fully downloadable PDFs available as soon as a book is published. But it makes measurement a challenge, as we've heard Eric say. Metadata is a problem, particularly for small experimental or perhaps less well-resourced presses, and which predominate, there are a lot of those in the monograph space. There are also issues around stable identifiers for books when we're looking for them in digital landscapes. So there's still a standard use of ISBNs rather than DOIs. There's a shift now towards DOIs, but some publishers are applying DOIs to books but not chapters. Other publishers are applying DOIs to books and chapters. And to make it all even more complicated, when we're looking for the digital traces of what's happening with specialist scholarly books in online landscapes and using webometrics type approaches, authors and publishers and libraries, when they're talking about books in social media and on different kinds of digital platforms, probably don't use either a DOI or an ISBN. Sometimes they're taking photographs of their beautiful book cover. Sometimes, they're tweeting a link to a publisher website. Sometimes they're tweeting links to OAPN and the platforms that are hosting this, but the content could be all over the place. So there are some interesting challenges. And of course, Eric's already covered this. A lot of the issues around tracking usage for open access books, I think, are not too dissimilar to journal articles. Of course, the content's open access, and that adds incredibly to its utility, especially in places where researchers don't necessarily have access to a library that's subscribing to content, or in development settings where researchers may not even have access to a high quality internet connection. So the use of data sticks and copy shops to share content among researchers is still popular because it works. So we just can't expect to capture every instance of use. But actually, we can see an incredible amount, I think. And that's in part because a lot of the hosting of open access books at the moment is fairly centralised. So programs like the OAPN Digital Library are doing a really good job of hosting and preserving open access content, and linking to open access content is fairly easy. And efforts to upgrade the metadata attached to books often resolve to a few links that we know about. And also because this is quite a collaborative community. So the groups who are interested in open access books tend to be willing to collaborate on projects that are sharing data and allowing us to kind of play around to see what we can make out of the different kinds of data that they're gathering up and have access to. So I'm just now going to spend a couple of minutes talking about geolocation. And a key aspect of the work that we've been working on over the last year or so with my research group has been thinking about how geolocation filtering might add nuance and sort of some rich information to what we understand about how open access books are being used. So you can see here that this is a geolocation map of the around 500 titles that were made available through the Knowledge Unlatched program. And I think it's interesting because we're starting now to see usage that's moving beyond North America and Western Europe. It's clear but not unexpected that we're seeing quite a lot of usage in India. But we're also starting to see South America and Africa increasing their use. So I haven't got a time series, but this map has changed quite a lot since our first Knowledge Unlatched pilot collection launch. And then if we dig into that a little bit further, we've been filtering by institutional IP address block. And you can see here the set of columns on the left shows you what we've been able to attribute in terms of usage to libraries that help to pay for the costs of making the Knowledge Unlatched collection open access. And it's only about 15% of total usage that we're seeing, which might be taken as a really good news story or something else. So we've been digging further into that, and this is very much a work in progress, so I'd really appreciate any feedback that anyone has on how we're slicing this data. But actually, when we take a look, what we're seeing is that usage is clustering around locations where we know there are reasonably sized research communities, and where we also know that libraries have actually supported Knowledge Unlatched collections. So we suspect that what we're actually seeing is users going outside of library networks and outside of library IP address ranges in order to engage with content. And one spin on that might be that it's actually a reflection of a different kind of user experience for readers of monographs and more flexibility in how monographs are being accessed by academics that are no longer restricted to university networks and library channels for accessing the content. And so we've got a final slide here, which is the usage which we could attribute just to MIT. And then if we had a look at usage in the Cambridge and Boston areas, this is for whole books, not for individual chapters, what that kind of usage looked like. So I've got lots more that I could tell you about, but I'm going to finish there and hand over. Okay, so